that immediately began to burn and sting. Exhaling a couple of times and bringing her breathing back to normal, the Duchess coldly asked how the girl knew about this. Lena smiled nervously, sweat appearing on her face, and the girl quickly explained that the teacher had told her everything. Leaning over her, Syria asked if Viscount Eason, her wise teacher, had told her that she hated it when it was mentioned, or that discussing personal family histories was considered a grave insult. Blue Eyes looked angry and furious, mentally wondering how much longer she had to continue to bend over backwards for those around her, even though Lena and Callus had deceived her, and she still continued to endure it. Leaning her hand on the back of the sofa near the saint's head, Syria said that no matter how much Callus repeated about the temporary nature of their marriage, she was still the Marchioness of Hanet, a saint and a Sterna. Leaning over, the girl said that people in such a position cannot say out loud everything that comes into their heads, disgracing those around them and citing the difficulty of understanding. Turning around, the blue-eyed girl finished her monologue by saying that the brunette was no longer a child and should be more prudent, occupying such a high position in society. She walked down the corridor, trying to overcome her own anger and wondering whether she should go to the priest and tell him all of Lena's insults. Leaning against the wall, the girl thought about what they could do, because no words could change the fact that for many she was still a villain. Thinking that it would be a good idea to go back, Syria turned around, remembering Begonia, who was present there and was probably in shock right now. Immediately crashing into someone, the blue-eyed girl screamed and yelped, slightly stepping back from her obstacle. The already familiar touch of a warm, wide hand stopped her from falling, catching her and helping her regain her previously lost balance. Rush, slightly disheveled, a little irritated, and hastily asked the lady what was happening to her. The girl froze in surprise, opening her wide blue eyes, and very hoarsely, almost in a whisper, greeted his lordship. Syria asked her husband in surprise why he was there. Had he really come for her? And the Archduke muttered that these were very strange questions. The man explained that he had been following her since she left the room, and the girl asked in surprise if this was true. Folding his arms across his chest, Rush said he felt like he was walking loud enough to attract attention. Stroking her sore cheek with her fingers, the blue-eyed girl smiled nervously and said that her thoughts seemed to have managed to distract her from the real world. Noticing the unusual lump and redness on Sterna's cheek, the Archduke stepped closer, took her chin in his hand, examining the damage. Perfectly understanding and realizing that she urgently needed to come up with some excuse for this wound, the girl smiled stupidly, but nothing came to her mind. Rush raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation, but looked more interested than angry. He suddenly noticed that this mark was very similar to the one that remained on others after interacting with Syria in the past, and the girl swallowed, not understanding how he knew about it. She waved her hand, admitting that he was right, and explained that she had hit herself because she and Mrs. Lena had argued. The man asked what they were talking about, and the blue-eyed woman hastened to assure him that there was nothing like that in this conversation, because she thought that he definitely did not come here for such conversations. She looked at Rush's gloomy face, who clearly wouldn't mind knowing all the details, but she realized that right now he didn't want to talk about the matter of the real series. Turning around abruptly, the blonde man said that now they had better get some air before heading into the hall to cool her cheek. Mentally wondering if the man was uninterested or just expressing his concern, Syria froze a little when he turned his head, asking if she was coming. She followed her husband, trying to keep up with his long, rhythmic steps. Marquis Callus, who saw them from the upper tier of the corridor, froze, quietly muttering the name of his now ex-fiancé. The girl walked arm in arm with Archduke Burke, and this seemed to suit her completely, and did not even sadden her. The man looked at the blue-eyed woman with interest and said something, and she was too close for a forced wife and kept up the conversation. He gripped the railing tighter with his fingers as jealousy burned in his soul like a nasty alcoholic drink. Rush and Syria sat on a bench in the garden, postponing the time of their appearance at the ball, because they were waiting for the speaking mark on her cheek to calm down. The Archduke closed his eyes, folding his arms across his chest, and the girl took advantage of the moment to look at him. But the man suddenly looked straight at her and asked why she didn't stop looking. Wanting to get out of the awkward situation, Sterna hastily muttered that she was simply worried about his white clothes getting dirty in the garden. Rush was not particularly satisfied with this answer, and so remained silent while his wife rubbed the back of her head and laughed nervously. A little later, the man said with a warm smile that sometimes he really wanted to look into her head and see what amazing things were going on there. Blue Eyes echoed his words in surprise, and the Archduke explained with a gentle smile that her thoughts were quite chaotic. Immediately causing his wife to blush, Rush affectionately said that, being honest, he would also be sorry if her dress were to get ruined if something happened. Immediately starting to fidget nervously and wave her hands, Syria quickly asked if he really liked the dress that Begonia recommended to her. Catching his thoughtful expression and overly deep gaze, the girl mentally recognized him as vulgar and blushed even more than before. Turning away and showing his reddened ears to the blue-eyed woman, the Archduke stood up, saying that it was time for them to go, since the reception had already begun. Sterna, covered by her husband's white jacket, jumped up with a dream to keep up with him, and suddenly asked if the Marquis of Hanet had come to the outbuilding. Without turning around, Rush asked why she suddenly decided to ask about this. The girl said she seemed to smell his perfume, which he used at some events. Feeling a distinct pang of jealousy, the Archduke turned to the blue-eyed girl and glanced at her, asking if he had heard everything correctly. Syria quickly explained that they simply had a rather unusual and specific smell, which is why she remembered it. The girl hesitantly asked if she had offended her husband, but he turned around and said that they had better hurry, otherwise they might be late. Walking forward, Rush thought irritably and a little upset about whether she really liked this bastard so much that she even remembered the scent of his perfume. They walked towards the palace together, step by step, leaving behind them the rich garden and elegant benches. At the same time, in the castle of the Burke House, the celebration and feast were already in full swing. It seemed that there was not a single dark room left in it. When the people present in the solemnly decorated hall noticed Marquise Hanet and St. Lena, they began to whisper, calling them shameless behind their backs. Noticing all these reproachful glances and conversations, the brunette looked down and told Callus that she felt very awkward being there. Turning his head towards the girl, the blonde man asked if she was going to tell him what had already happened between her and Syria today. Turning away in irritation, the girl said that she had already told him several times that she had only come to apologize, and that Stern had made an incomprehensible scene. She angrily said that she didn't want to think about it anymore, and therefore her husband should stop reminding her about it. Suddenly, the heavy doors located in the very center of the hall, on the dais, swung open, and servants loudly asked to greet His Grace, Archduke Rush Burke, and Her Grace, Syria Stern. Callus looked jealously at the blue-eyed woman, who was hugging the man by the hand and smiling brightly, almost glowing with happiness, like the sun. The guests present began to speak with admiration about how charming and gentle the newly minted mistress was. One of the ladies of high society noticed that even the Duke and Duchess's clothes, made in dark blue and white, matched each other. Listening to compliments and praise from all sides, Syria covered her bright smile with her hand and pressed herself even closer to her husband. St. Lena listened with anger and envy as people discussed how the blue-eyed lady was absolutely worthy of being the star of the evening. Noticing familiar faces, Rush asked his wife why she was there, asking if their invitations had been canceled. Awkwardly rubbing her hand with her palm, the girl asked how she could justify this decision, and the Archduke replied that there were simply a ton of reasons and she should have simply chosen anyone. Syria exhaled and muttered that they all deserved to be here no less than she did, since she was not the star of the evening, as many said. After a pause, Rush spread his hands a little, affectionately asking that if the star was not his wife, then who else? Lena, who was staring at them with wide-open yellow eyes, suddenly thought that in the presence of these two, she felt like a third wheel. Viscount Ison, the girl's teacher, noticed her impulses and placed his hand on her fragile shoulder, distracting the saint. When the brunette turned to face him, the man asked if he hadn't advised her not to approach Mrs. Syria at all for a while. Scratching the back of her head, the blue-eyed lady said that she could not look at things in any other way than from a more modest point of view. Calling his wife by name and placing his palm on his chest, Rush repeated in a firm but soft and soothing tone that this reception was arranged only for her and not for everyone present. The fair-haired man said with a caring smile that, according to tradition, the ball should be opened by the stars of the evening, and then asked if she would do him such an honor. Syria blushed brightly and responded to his lordship with consent, lowering her palm into the strong hand that was extended. The festively decorated hall was filled with live music. The best orchestra harmoniously played a pleasant waltz melody. Rush wrapped his strong arm around his wife's thin waist and confidently and skillfully led her in the dance, concentrating only on them and simply forgetting about everything else. St. Lena asked her teacher why only the Archduke and his wife danced at such a ball. He explained that His Highness was a very highly titled person. The Archdukes of the House of Burke had been at the level of the imperial family since time immemorial. The brunette asked how she and Callus were doing with such things, and the Viscount evasively replied that their position was also quite high. While the girl looked enviously at the couple twirling in the dance, the man added that in the Empire there is a clear line between the aristocracy and the imperial family. One of the servants approached the Viscount, saying that the Marquis of Calais Hanet was looking for him, and he turned around, saying that he would come to his master in a moment. Having bowed to the saint, the man said that he had to step away for a couple of minutes and left, but the girl hardly paid any attention to him. Looking at Rush and Syria waltzing and smiling, Lena thought that perhaps she would be even better off on the other side. Later, the Duchess went out onto her private terrace and ordered the servants not to let anyone in, looking at the night sky and thinking that the statement that the future could not be predicted in advance was true. She thought with a smile that only a few days ago she had thought of becoming the Marchioness of House Hanet if the wedding had gone smoothly. At the time, it seemed to her that Callis's feelings were real, but he still couldn't get rid of Lena the same way as it was described in the book. Thinking about the failed marriage and the completely unexpected marriage, the blue-eyed girl remembered Rush's warm hands, thinking with regret that, in the course of the original story, she should have lost them. Lowering her head and closing her eyes, the girl sighed, deciding that she didn't even want to think about the development of the plot right now. Suddenly, her peace was interrupted by the annoying saint, who deftly slipped onto the terrace and called the lady by name. Stepping closer to the Duchess, the brunette clasped her hands and said that they should finish the conversation they started earlier. Meanwhile, in the hall, Rush asked Lennon where Syria had gone, and he replied that she had gone to the terrace, and the man asked whether he was talking about the Archduchess's private quarters. The assistant, recalling the efforts he had to make to persuade the girl to go there, said that the place had been closed for a long time, and he had finally decided to open it despite the fact that the marriage was only temporary. Immediately fearing the possible reaction of the stern gentleman, Lennon hastened to ask if this was not too self-confident on his part, but Rush replied that everything was correct. With a smile on his face, thinking about his spouse, the fair-haired man muttered that it was very rare for her to be in pleasant solitude these days. Spotting Marquis Calais in the crowd, he whispered thoughtfully that there was nothing wrong with giving the lady this opportunity. At this time, Syria told the unwanted guest that this was the Archduchess's terrace, where even her own husband had no right to barge in or enter. Pressing her palms to her chest, Lena did not listen to anything instructive and said that she asked Marquis Hanet for a divorce. Tears welled up in the brunette's eyes when the already tired and irritated blue-eyed girl asked without interest what should follow from this. She spread her arms wide and said that she had heard that it was as difficult for Stern to get divorced as it was to get married, and therefore not everything could work out right away. Grabbing Syria by the hand, the saint screamed, promising to return to the girl what she had taken from her. Exhaling loudly through clenched teeth, the Duchess said that Lena still seemed to have not understood everything that had happened. Abruptly pulling her hand out of the unwanted bonds, the blue-eyed woman confidently declared that it did not matter to her at all whether death or divorce separated the saint from her husband, because it would not change the fact that she no longer had feelings for Calais. Turning away and stroking her forehead with her hand, the lady irritably asked what Lena wanted from her, and she hastened to answer that she didn't want anything at all. Taking her hand away from her face, the girl saw the Marquis in the doorway, who, however, was in no hurry to come into them, but was only listening. Standing there, the young man heard his wife scream that she knew she was not needed in this place. The saint shouted to Syria that in her presence she immediately felt like a third wheel, and the blue-eyed girl felt something evil approaching. These words were exactly the same as those that Stern must have said to Rush, not understanding why the restless Lena was saying them now. Knowing full well that the main character was the saint, the blue-eyed girl simply wanted to save her life and told the girl that Calais was standing outside the door. She added that she was sure that from her position, Lena would have definitely seen him, realizing how she was still manipulating, and she covered her mouth with her hand. Growing more and more angry at the current situation, Syria asked if the girl really wanted the Marquis to hear everything and not stop believing in her sincerity. Clenching her hands into fists, she assumed that the brunette was also simply trying to make her interlocutor look bad. Thinking that it was a terrible injustice to remain forever in the camp of villains, the blue-eyed one said with resentment that she had never done anything to the saint. Turning around, the girl declared that if the brunette refused to leave, then she would leave the terrace herself, and Lena rushed after her. Suddenly, the moon glowed a bright pink, and the girl clutched her chest, her bright yellow eyes wide. When Syria turned around at the scream and touch, the saint was no longer behind her, only a white shoe lay on the cold floor. The Marquis, who had entered the terrace, raised his hand and covered his face from the bright, blinding light of the moon. He looked around and realized that St. Lena was nowhere to be found. Only the new Duchess was standing at the very railing and looking somewhere ahead of herself. The girl looked at the sky in surprise, realizing that she had read about something similar, but was completely amazed to see it with her own eyes. Callus's sudden call made her turn around, and the young man shouted angrily, asking if Syria had pushed Lena down. Looking at the once beloved man, the blue-eyed woman even froze from such impudence, unable to quickly cope with such an accusation. The servant ran up to the Marquis, stammering and asking his lord how he could speak such a thing about his mistress. Turning away and rubbing her face with her palm, the girl called him by name and asked if he was really going to torment her to the very end. Immediately realizing the gravity and groundlessness of his accusation, Callus extended his hand to the girl and began to mumble that he had not meant this at all. Here, after a bright flash of light, Lena appeared again right in the sky, and Syria realized that she was right, because in the original story, the saint left and returned from her world several times. Marquis Hannett caught the falling girl and held her close to his body, asking excitedly if she was okay and what had happened here. Holding her head on her husband's shoulder, the brunette suddenly began to scream shrilly that she was not there yet. She grabbed the Marquis by the neck, but she herself was torn somewhere to the side and almost squealed, asking for help, while Callus tried to calm her down, hugging her with his arms. Thinking that none of what had happened directly concerned her, Syria turned around, still stunned by Callus's assumption that he thought she was the killer, and walked forward. The Marquis shouted that he hadn't meant that at all and asked the girl not to make a problem out of it, but seeing the cold gaze of the blue-eyed girl, he fell silent. The Duchess left, not wanting to watch such scenes any longer, and listened to the senseless cries of the annoying couple. Walking down the stairs, Syria thought about how, ever since she found herself in the body of an incorrigible villain, she had done everything to survive and save her reputation, which had long since sunk to the very bottom. Crouching down and covering her face with her hands, the girl sighed. Thinking that she had been very happy when Callus had proposed to her, it all seemed like a reward for her efforts. Remembering the moments with him, the blue-eyed girl reflected on the fact that even though the Marquis had chosen Lena, leaving his bride on the threshold of death, hearing him accuse her of murder was too much. Continuing to sit on the floor, the girl thought that everything she had done was in vain. But suddenly, someone approached her. Looking down at his new wife, Rush called the girl by name, surprised at her situation. Removing her hand from her face, she muttered quietly that she always let him look at her while she was in this state. The Archduke sat down next to her, smiling softly, and remarked that this was happening solely because he constantly found her in this state. The girl quietly asked if he had heard everything, and the fair-haired man replied that the saint and the Marquis had not spoken quietly enough to hide the essence of what was happening. His face was slightly frowning as he sat opposite his wife and looked at her extremely sad and depressed expression. Rush extended his hand forward and gently touched the blue-eyed girl's cheek, and she immediately looked up at him and forced a smile. The man looked into her wet, reddened eyes and quietly whispered that she was about to cry. Syria looked at the Archduke, whose presence seemed to allow her to be weak and not to defend her rights, not to fight. Leaning closer to him, feeling his warm hands on her shoulders, the girl nodded in agreement, muttering that she really seemed ready to cry. The next day, the sun was already illuminating the snow-covered roofs of the palace. Life within its walls continued to boil even after what had happened. Lenin, sitting opposite his mistress, told her that the high priest, who was angry, took St. Lena and carried her away from the castle. Pressing her fingers to her lips, the blue-eyed girl recalled the image of High Priest Amos, thinking that he was a stern man, but never one to get angry. The girl asked the assistant if he had come to her chambers so early in order to tell her this news, but the fair-haired man shook his head, explaining that his lordship had not yet spoken with his wife about one matter. Syria raised her head with interest and asked what exactly they were supposed to discuss. Lenin excitedly asked the lady if she had heard about the Laurel estate today, but their conversation was interrupted by the opening door. The Marquis of Callus entered the Duchess's chambers, put his hand to his chest, called the girl by name, and asked her to give him a little time before leaving. The Archduke's assistant turned around, wanting to prevent another scandal, and asked the Marquis if he hadn't noticed him. Stepping forward closer to Syria, Hannett said Lenin could decide for himself whether to stay or leave. The blue-eyed girl turned to him without getting up from the sofa, when the young man knelt down and quietly called her name. Callus asked his ex-fiancée for forgiveness, and immediately added that he understood that any apology would not heal the wounds he had inflicted. The Archduke's assistant stared at the Marquis in surprise and almost fell off the sofa when he asked if the girl wanted to give him another chance. Syria asked coldly what might change if they decided to start a relationship over again, and if he was sure that he wouldn't go to Lena again if she called. Hannett froze and tried to object, but it was as if he himself was not sure of himself and his answer, and therefore began to stutter. Blue-Eyed immediately noticed this and corrected herself that he would not just walk, but run, as soon as the saint pronounced his name. With his head down like a guilty boy, the Marquis listened as the girl reminded him of what had happened yesterday, saying that he had blamed her for Lena's disappearance. She said dryly that even the servant had not thought of such a suggestion, and only one former fiancé doubted her innocence. Sighing immediately, Syria said that she could understand his behavior, since her reputation in high society was rather dubious. Stroking her elbow, the blue-eyed girl remembered that he, moreover, almost lost his hand because of her, reminding her of the scandal with Rush. The girl decided that she was against suffering further just to avoid a tragic death, and so she jumped up from her seat and angrily said that she was fed up with his attitude because he had inflicted a deep wound on her. Syria realized that she was no longer going to justify all the absurd situations with the plot of the book, and added that she did not want to worry forever about whether the young man would run to Lena again. Blue-Eyed mentally promised herself that from now on she would not live in fear, and took the ring given to her by the Marquis out of the velvet box. Throwing the jewelry at Callus, the girl added that their relationship was now over. Leaving the kneeling boy behind, Syria calmly walked forward and told Lennon they would talk outside, and he jumped up in agreement. As the door slammed behind them, the Marquis of Hannett was left alone, looking at the ring he had once given to the girl he loved. Shedding large tears, the young man trembled with regret, whispering as if someone could hear that he was incredibly sorry. When the lady and her assistant went outside, she straightened her fur coat and asked what he wanted to talk about before everything that happened. Worried about the girl's mental health, Lennon said that they could not discuss it now, but Syria asked why not. The man said that it was somehow tactless to disturb a person who had gone through a breakup, and suggested that she probably exhausted herself with tears. But the blue-eyed girl raised her hands, declaring that she had not cried at all, and had simply expressed what had been boiling in her soul for a long time. Clearing her throat into her fist to hide the traces of her anger, the girl asked what he wanted to tell her. But the lady was suddenly distracted again by Elliot, who had approached, and Abby, who was happily waving and calling to her. Hugging her friend, Syria exclaimed that she had been through a lot, but the knight assured her with a smile that nothing particularly terrible had happened. Pulling off her winter cape, the blue-eyed girl asked the girl to take it, because it was the warmest, and the dark-haired girl quickly said that it was not at all necessary. Covering her friend despite her embarrassment, the blue-eyed girl said that it was too cold in prison, and now she should go to the kitchen and eat something hot. Abigail immediately became more serious and asked if the lady had decided which of the pair, the Marquis or the Saint, or both, she should kill. But the girl declared that she did not wish anyone to die. The knight assured her that she could act discreetly, and Elliot asked her to speak more carefully in the presence of strangers. Already in the mood for a serious conversation, Lennon clenched his fists and let out a childish cry, asking everyone present to let him speak. Syria turned around when the assistant said that he had something extremely important to report, and the blond man explained that there was a place in the Burke domain that was very famous in certain circles. The man spread his arms wide and said that this was the Laurel Estate, where the Archduke would be heading tomorrow with his wife. Blue Eyes remembered that only the closest relatives of the Burke family could stay at this estate, and the original story only mentioned that everyone had long forgotten about it. Putting his hand to his chest, Lennon said that he had finally managed to convey everything. Otherwise, his lordship, it seemed, would not have been able to talk to his wife in person. He said that the girl was probably confused to suddenly learn that they were going to set out tomorrow, but she should still try to prepare, and the girl nodded in agreement. The next day, the procession of the Archduke and his wife moved to their destination along a long-traveled route through the snowy forest. Suddenly waking up and blushing brightly, the girl did not quite understand what was happening, clearly feeling someone else's hands on her body. Realizing that she was lying in Rush's arms in a nightgown, wrapped in her own blanket, Syria opened her eyes wide, thinking that no one had warned her about such things. Looking at his wife, the fair-haired man gently advised her to go back to sleep, because the road promised to be long. Blue-Eyed feverishly thought about how she could fall asleep at all, being in such a terribly awkward position. An hour earlier, still in the palace, Rush walked down the corridor to his wife's chambers and said that it was time for them to set off before the snowstorm got worse. Already fully dressed in travel gear and insulated armor, the man stepped toward Syria's bed and wanted to ask if she was ready, but froze. The girl was still sleeping soundly, snoring and holding the warm blanket to her chest, not at all intending to wake up. The maid, frightened by the anger of the stern Archduke, said that she would immediately hurry to wake up His Highness's wife. He leaned down gently and carefully and wrapped Syria in a warm down blanket, whispering that this should not be done. Rush carefully picked up his wife, saying that she seemed to be sleeping peacefully for the first time in a long time. Pressing Syria to his chest and holding her tightly with his strong arms without much effort, looking up and making it clear that they would go like this. And now the two of them were sitting in the carriage, which was traveling to the Laurel estate, surrounded by knights and guards of the Burke house. Reaching for the opposite seat, a terribly embarrassed Syria asked to be let go, saying she wanted to move to the other side. The Archduke replied that he could not let the girl down from his arms, arguing that she was without shoes, and the blue-eyed girl asked why this had happened at all. Rush explained that he hadn't had time to grab her slippers, but there was definitely one pair in his luggage, so she should sleep like that. But Syria wondered if he himself could sleep in such conditions. Muttering that he knew it all, the man declared that it was too cold in the carriage and touched her feet with his large hand, causing the girl to squeak quietly. The blue-eyed girl asked him not to touch her, feeling the warm touch of a strong male hand, and the blonde-haired man asked in confusion why. She asked, embarrassed, that he was also asking the reason, and then explained that the Archduke hardly always touched other people's feet so easily and calmly. The man did not see a problem with this at all, and said with a smile that she was not another person at all, but his wife. Syria, stuttering with embarrassment, said that touching the legs was still a little different. Turning away from Rush's face, the girl tried to ask the question that interested her, but she could hardly gather her courage, not very often communicating on such topics. The Archduke's face fell when the blue-eyed girl suddenly asked if he had taken her to Laurel's estate to spend their wedding night. This suggestion made the man laugh incredibly, and so he grinned and looked away, saying that this is exactly what would happen at the estate. As the carriage drove forward, Syria childishly declared that he was lying, and when her husband asked how she had guessed, she replied that it was written all over his face. Reassuring the naive girl, Rush ingratiatingly explained that he was holding her feet because she was cold, and there was no other way to warm them up. Having quietly cleared her throat, the blue-eyed woman raised her gaze to him and turned to his lordship, deciding to make a request. To his pleasant surprise, the girl asked him to allow her to do something as his archduchess, and the man smiled. Noticing his gaze, Syria quickly corrected herself that she was asking for this favor as stern, but the man chuckled. Rush gently pulled her closer, asking why she had corrected herself, since she really was his archduchess. Covering his wife's legs with a blanket, the blonde smiled warmly at the way she shuddered, reacting to his every movement with embarrassment. Looking at her with bright red eyes, Rush said that if she was not against this, then it was not in his power to contradict the girl. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted, because the carriage stopped abruptly and almost overturned, and from the street there was a loud neighing of horses and the cries of knights. Looking out the window, the Archduke asked what had happened, and the blood in his veins froze for a moment when he heard the clanging of swords and screams. It turned out that a crowd of monsters, known in the Empire for their bloodthirstiness, had emerged from the dark, snowy forest onto their procession. Rush asked Elliot how far it was to the estate, and when he heard that it was right on course, he ordered all the knights to don astral armor. Having seated Syria on the seat, the man said that they were very lucky that Sterna was nearby, and also asked her to stay in the carriage and promised that he would send her to Lenin's girlfriend. She pulled the blanket around herself, looking fearfully after the Archduke, who, without a hint of fear, was giving out instructions and getting out of the car on the move. The blue-eyed girl suddenly couldn't hold back her impulse and reached forward, grabbing his red cloak with her tenacious fingers. The blonde turned around and froze, seeing how worried and even scared Syria looked now, and how desperately she was holding on to him. She quietly asked him to take care of himself, and Rush agreed, carefully removing her hand from his robe because he could not hesitate. When the carriage door slammed behind him and the blue-eyed girl looked at the blizzard swirling outside, she thought that it wasn't just the weather that was terrible today. Elliot ordered his knights to protect the carriage, and he himself did not lag behind, swinging his long and sharp sword at the next monster. The girl pressed her palm to her lips in fear, wondering why the monsters had appeared and whether it could have happened because she hadn't been to the glacier for just a couple of days. Suddenly, the second door of the carriage opened, and Lenin entered the cabin, greeted the lady, and sat down opposite her. He noted with a nervous smile that it was very warm here, and the blue-eyed girl asked, a little surprised, whether he had ridden a horse with the knights. The assistant replied that he was traveling with luggage, explaining that he could only read something there, but then he stopped short and corrected himself, saying that they were in such a hurry and he needed to check something there. Becoming a little more serious, Lennon said that he had remembered some important information and asked Syria not to speak respectfully to anyone or about anyone except his lordship when they arrived at the scene. The man lowered his head and said that if she couldn't handle it, things would be bad, and the carriage door almost flew off its hinges from the alien movement. Lennon suddenly screamed, noticing the terrifying creature and the frightening red eyes opposite it, the look of which certainly did not bode well. The girl swallowed loudly and pressed her back against the other door, screaming that they both needed to get out of here as soon as possible. They didn't have time to jump out through the next door, because a huge monster grabbed the top of the carriage with its paws and knocked it over to one side with a crash. Rush turned and looked forward in fear, gripping the hilt of his sword tighter as one of the knights shouted that their carriage was under attack. Shouting out the name of his bride, the Archduke rushed straight towards this creature with all the speed that was available to him. Waking up after the carriage hit the ground hard, Syria opened her eyes, blinked a couple of times, and exhaled. She sat up and looked at Lennon, asking how he was feeling, and he groaned as he stood up. The assistant raised his head and adjusted his glasses, asking her ladyship if she was injured, but his cheek was gaping with black and purple demon energy. The man muttered that he seemed to feel fine, only his head was a little dizzy, probably from shock or a blow, but the lady knew the reason. She lunged towards Lennon, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck so that her divine magical energy could deal with the obscurantism that had latched onto the assistant. The girl ordered him to sit quietly and said that it would be very bad if the demonic force managed to poison his body. Syria's ability to purify was not all-encompassing, but with this little, she was ready to cope, or at least try. Blue-Eyed felt everything inside her sink in horror as the monster reminded her of itself by opening the carriage door and growling loudly with a low, muffled wheeze. His huge, clawed paw was already reaching out towards the girl, but she had nowhere to run, so she remained sitting next to Lennon. The sudden squeal of the monster and the cracking of its skin were caused by a strong, even crushing blow of the sword that Rush dealt. Breathing heavily and looking sullenly at his wife, he glanced at her for damage and asked if she was hurt. The girl, still hugging her assistant, breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile that everything was fine, and then the Archduke asked if Lennon was alive. He raised himself a little and whispered something indistinctly, making his voice heard so that those around him could have no doubt about his viability. The blond man said with a metallic voice that if his assistant had not died, he did not know how such a strong embrace with his wife could be justified. Hastily explaining that she was simply healing him of demonic energy, Syria said that everything was ready and moved away. While Rush was jealously looking at the couple, the blue-eyed woman took her subordinate's face in her hands and added that, thank the goddess, everything was fine with him, but he only froze, fearing the Archduke's reaction. The knights reported that they had successfully dealt with all the monsters and could now continue their journey to Laurel's estate. The only nuance was that the carriage, overturned to the ground by the monster, was irreparably broken, and the lady could not continue her journey in it. Rush, without even turning around, calmly announced to Syria that from now on they would be forced to ride a horse. Pulling her fur coat tighter around herself, the girl smiled and replied that there was absolutely nothing wrong with that, since she was holding up well in the saddle. The Archduke asked what this meant, and the blue-eyed girl looked at him a little uncomprehendingly and surprised, asking what it meant. Later, when she learned what mode of transportation her husband had in mind, Syria quietly muttered that she felt like luggage. She sat in front of Rush, who was holding her close with one arm, and muttered that she felt like a silkworm cocoon, and the man calmly replied that such insects did not live in his house. The blond man muttered that she was cold as ice and should sit still to keep from freezing to death, and Stern asked if it was necessary to express concern in such words. Feeling his hot breath on the top of her head, the blue-eyed girl thought that he was very warm, even despite all this metal armor. Much later, Rush carefully lowered Syria to the ground in front of the gates of the place they had been heading towards all this time. The girl saw the dark and snow-covered Laurel estate, with only a few windows lit up. The Archduke carried his wife inside, and Lennon followed them into the corridor, decorated in green flowers but covered in dirt of unknown origin. Looking around the huge space with glowing balls, a huge chandelier and ornaments made of gold, but covered in black smeared dirt, Syria blinked her eyes in amazement. She thought about the fact that she had already felt something unpleasant outside, a strange energy emanating from the entire estate. Rush, as always, noticed the girl's thoughtful look and gaze directed at nothing, and therefore began to worry that, as expected, she did not like this whole spectacle. The man asked what was the matter, and the blue-eyed girl immediately froze, hastily assuring him that nothing was the matter. She said that this Burke estate was different from the main one, and after her words, she noticed a woman coming down the stairs. The stranger was strong and wiry, and also a little dark. Her chestnut hair was gathered into a hairstyle, and her wide golden eyes looked at the guests with interest. When the woman called Syria mistress and heard the word temporary, she immediately screamed at how Rush could treat marriage like a food sample, and asked several times if he had really kidnapped his wife. Flying up to the girl, she squeezed the frozen palms, worriedly saying that they were cold as ice. Rubbing the young mistress's hands with her calloused fingers, the maid chattered discontentedly about how they had even gotten here. Blushing brightly, Syria mentally noted that the stranger's hands, despite the roughness of her skin, were warm and gentle. Lennon suddenly told the Archduke that the knights were waiting for him at the gate, and he turned his head, replying that he would come out and talk to him now. Addressing the woman and calling her Martha, the man asked her to take his wife in her arms, and she desperately screamed that she had her own legs. Before she could finish the sentence about the dirty floor and the horrific awkwardness of it all, Martha picked her up as easily as if it didn't cause her the slightest discomfort. Syria, feeling shame wash over her, smiled nervously and told the lady that she was quite strong, and the woman thanked her and asked her to call her by her first name. Claiming that he needed to take care of business, Rush headed for the exit with a quick but calm gait, and his wife wanted to wave to him, but didn't quite have time. She froze with her palm raised and muttered for him to take care of himself when the door slammed shut, and Martha explained that the gentleman was stingy with emotions. The woman, as if to remind her, asked the lady not to address her in a respectful manner, but to communicate in the same way as, for example, with Lennon. Not quite understanding what the problem was, Syria said that she always spoke respectfully to the assistant, and Marta glared at him. Smiling, she seemed to hide her anger, and declared that she would wait for a satisfactory explanation from the young man. Turning away and walking towards the stairs, Martha said that the lady needed to take a hot bath as soon as possible because she was cold as ice. Later, lying in the water, from which a pleasant steam came, relaxing the whole body, Syria mentally thanked the gods for the fact that this room was clean. Gently rubbing a special balm into the girl's hair, Martha said with a soft smile that she thought that His Majesty had kidnapped her and decided to hide her here, but the blue-eyed girl objected, saying that he was not that kind of person at all. The woman added with a gentle voice that Rush was also more emotional than he might seem at first glance. Lowering herself into the water to hide her burning cheeks, Syria thought about all the times they had shared when he had seemed cold but cared for her. Blue-eyed suddenly broke away from these thoughts and looked around the room, thinking that the bathroom looked simply amazing compared to all the rooms of the estate that she had seen. Martha, as if hearing her thoughts, explained that usually only servants used it because the rest were in an unacceptable state. Turning around, the girl asked if there were other people there, and the maid nodded, listing the butler and the gardener among the other people. Looking down, Syria thought that she had assumed that no one was taking care of the estate since it was in such a state. Hearing Martha's question about whether she was warm, the girl nodded, continuing to guess what events led to Rush abandoning this place so much. Later, in the dining room, Lennon remarked that the Laurel estate was just as he had last seen it, and the butler agreed. The young man asked if Mr. Bastian was comfortable living here, adding that everyone was talking about how the butler of the Burke house never showed up at the main estate. The man smiled, showing the fine wrinkles around his eyes, and said that he had lived here for 10 years already, and, besides, guests rarely came to the main estate. As he set out the plates, he asked if the new Archduchess was the same Syria Stern whom Lennon had called cruel and ignorant that year. Leaning forward, the young man asked the butler not to tell anyone about his past opinion, since now they were both in excellent standing and nothing should change that, and he only agreed. Still, unable to contain his interest, Bastian asked what the girl had done to cause him to change his mind so dramatically. Syria, who appeared at the door, already dressed in a beautiful white dress after a shower, asked with a smile what they were talking about. Hastily seating the girl at the table, Lennon said that they had discussed changes to the Laurel estate, and then asked if Martha was bothering her, but then, without waiting for an answer, ran off, adding that he would now bring the prepared food. The blue-eyed girl smiled a little in surprise when the butler bowed to her and said that it was a real honor for him to meet her. He placed his hand on his chest and introduced himself as the butler of the Burke household, saying that he would be glad if the lady would call him simply by his first name. Syria thought that she had indeed never seen the butler of the main estate, and she smiled and replied to Bastian that she was also glad to meet him. Bowing, the man said that the others were busy with their business, and he asked to forgive them for greeting the lady later, and she waved her hands, assuring that there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. Bastian said that he would bring food now, and the lady could talk to Mr. Lennon for now, but the blue-eyed woman froze, noticing even more of this strange black mold behind his head, on the ceiling and wall. Noticing the slimy, dark-colored substance, the girl thought with disgust that it was also moving, and then suggested that it could be solidified demonic energy. Covering her mouth with her hand, Syria realized that if her guess was correct, then all of these were demonic shadows, that is, energy that had hardened and appeared as a side effect of curses. They played a significant role in the second part of the story, where Lena gained influence over the imperial family when she was able to clear the bizarre demonic shadows that were bothering the other Sterns and the high priest. Thinking that if the saint had cleansed them in the imperial palace, then her help would play into their hands here too, the blue-eyed one did not immediately understand that Lennon had asked if she had heard about this from his lordship. She asked again, clarifying what the assistant meant, and he looked around the room, pointing out all the mold. Sighing and folding his arms across his chest, Lennon said that they might cause discomfort to the lady, but the Archduke had already tried almost everything. The Archduchess looked at the assistant with a slightly puzzled expression when he said that the gentleman had, in the end, had to call someone here. Lennon explained that they had invited mages from the kingdom of Nesla to the estate, and Syria's blue eyes widened in surprise. Looking around, the young man said that the estate had been blooming with this mold of unknown origin for 15 years, and no one could do anything about it. Remembering that the church condemned magicians, calling them heretics, the girl put her hands on her knees and asked if it was worth telling her about this, since she was Sterna. Slapping his face with a white-gloved hand, the assistant muttered that his lordship would generously reward his wife for her silence. When Syria asked why he had brought her here then, Lennon explained that the Archduke was keen to introduce his chosen one to Martha, who had raised him, and she blushed brightly. Hiding her blush behind awkward touches to her cheeks, the blue-eyed girl said that they could come after the magicians had performed this ritual. Surprising, and even a little frightening the girl, the young man declared that turning to the magicians was, in truth, the very last attempt to save the estate. Rush stood outside, looking at the estate illuminated by the setting sun, when Elliot called out to the master. The Archduke turned around, asking how things were going with the monsters, and the head of the Knights of House Burkhoff confidently said that they had sorted everything out. Hearing the young man ask why the magicians were delayed, the gentleman muttered that they were probably hindered by the snowfall and would simply arrive tomorrow. Ordering Elliot not to worry about anything, gather the knights and return to the main estate. Rush said with a smile that this time they definitely saved her. At the same time, Martha led the girl into the richly decorated chambers and explained that the mistress's personal chambers were not yet fully ready, since they had not been informed of the arrival in advance, but the blue-eyed girl assured her that this room was also quite good. The woman approached the Archduchess and took her fragile hand in hers, kneading it and gently giving it a kind of relaxing massage. Once again reminding Syria that she shouldn't treat the local inhabitants with excessive respect, Martha said that the lady was a charming girl. Placing her forehead on the blue-eyed woman's palm as a blessing, the woman sincerely said that it was an honor and a joy for her to serve such an Archduchess, even for a couple of days. Stern thought about those words, remembering Lennon lamenting the mold eating away at the estate and how it wouldn't last much longer. Then she hastened to ask the assistant why they were not organizing an urgent evacuation of the servants from here, but the young man only answered that she herself would find out everything later. Syria lowered her head, thinking that for the first time she didn't understand what was happening because there was no information about it in the book. The woman went to the window and said that the gentleman was late, and therefore his wife could go to bed already, and she quietly agreed. Blue-eyed asked where his lordship would spend the night, and Martha, looking at her mistress in surprise and drawing the curtains, replied that, of course, here. Stern stood at attention, wondering how this was possible, and her eyes seemed to double in size for a moment. The maid replied with a smile and delight that she had previously forgotten to mention that these chambers belonged to the Archduke himself. A little later, Rush was walking down the corridor, followed by Bastian, who meticulously carried his master's red cloak. Having met Marta on his way, the man told her how his wife was feeling, and the woman replied with a smile that she was apparently tired from the long journey and therefore fell asleep. Bastian asked if she was really the same Syria Stern, because she was like a different person, whom Lenin had described to him completely differently a couple of years ago. Without stopping, the Archduke calmly replied that it was indeed she, and the butler asked what event could have caused such a strong change. Stopping in place, Rush hoarsely said that, contrary to their expectations, nothing special had happened, and in fact, the blue-eyed girl had simply fallen in love with the scoundrel. Not wanting to continue or develop this topic, the man said that it was time for him to rest and headed straight to the bathroom. Returning to his quarters in normal clothes, Rush reflected on everything that had happened during today's terribly long and nervous day. Suddenly discovering Syria sleeping in a chair, the astonished Archduke froze, thinking that Martha had not even hinted to him that his wife was sleeping in his personal chambers. The fair-haired man was even more surprised by the fact that the girl, bent over in three, was sleeping not on a spacious, comfortable bed, but in an ordinary chair. Muttering that the blue-eyed girl was quite compact, the man carefully lifted her into his arms, interrupting the even rhythm of her snoring with his action. He carefully laid her down on the bed, straightening out her nightgown, which was crumpled here and there, and looked at her with some pleasure, peacefully resting in his chambers. Sitting down in the chair and guessing the motives for such a choice of sleeping place, Rush thought with a smile that it would be better for her to fall asleep on the bed right away. Noticing how Syria was fidgeting and snorting discontentedly, trying to wrap herself more in the blanket, the man sat up, wondering if she would freeze. Looking back at the slowly smoldering logs in the fireplace, the Archduke sighed and muttered that she had fallen asleep without even keeping the fire going, and that she had been quite a nuisance. But for some reason, this thought did not anger him. When Stern let out a loud moan, the man turned his gaze to her, wondering if she was still not warm enough, and assuming that the room was not an overly warm place, since the fire had been lit recently and had quickly gone out. Sitting on the bed, Rush covered the girl with a blanket as carefully as possible, thinking that he had to take care of this precious Stern. Fidgeting on the bed and feeling the pleasant warmth from the blanket, the blue-eyed girl turned on her side, facing her husband, and smiled in her sleep. The Archduke suddenly remembered how hot and embarrassed she had been when she had asked if they would spend their wedding night at Laurel's estate. Shaking his head and getting ready to get out of bed, Rush muttered that he was thinking about the wrong thing. Syria suddenly raised her hand and placed it directly on her husband's waist, without waking up, and breathing evenly and calmly. Finding himself in the peculiar embrace of his young wife, the fair-haired man blushed deeply and froze, struggling with a dozen intrusive thoughts at once. Early in the morning, the sun had already flooded Mr. Burke's chambers with its bright light, preventing its inhabitants from sleeping peacefully. Touching Rush's chest with her fingers in her sleep, the blue-eyed girl thought without a second thought that it was very warm and elastic. Catching herself at this thought, she opened her eyes wide, seeing before her the half-naked Archduke, who was still sleeping. Realizing that she was lying wrapped in a blanket, like a cocoon, and the man's hands were tightly squeezing her waist, the girl felt a simultaneous surge of joy, horror, and embarrassment. Turning sharply to disentangle herself from the blanket and his embrace, Syria panicked as to why the blonde man had held her so tightly in his sleep. Sitting up on the bed, the girl turned to her husband and carefully, thoughtfully pulled the blanket over his shoulder so that he could rest a little more. Involuntarily looking at Rush, peacefully sleeping next to her, whose face was not yet distorted by all the cares of the world, and whose chest rose evenly from slow breathing, she could not help but notice how attractive he was. Sitting next to him and looking at her husband without a twinge of conscience, Syria silently wondered how a person could have such perfect facial features, thinking that it would be nice if the Archduke became a little kinder. When the man opened his beautiful eyes, his wife realized that there was very little chance of laughing it off and simply froze, blushing brightly, because she had been caught red-handed. Turning around and moving to the edge of the bed, the girl stuttered and wished him good morning, and Rush sleepily asked why she was leaving immediately after admiring him. Syria stood up and said that nothing like that happened. In fact, she simply covered the man with a blanket so that he would not freeze. When the blonde man stood up and stretched, the blue-eyed woman asked if Martha had carried her to the bed, but the man calmly objected, adding that he had done it. Stern turned around to ask why, and Rush asked sarcastically if he really had to leave his wife to sleep in the chair and take up the entire bed by himself. He asked why the girl had decided to sleep bent over in 3 depths, and she evasively replied that it was more comfortable for her to sleep that way. The Archduke suggested that his wife was worried that her behavior would cross the line, and Syria blushed as red as a tomato and sharply declared that this was not true, although the opposite was obvious. After a little morning bickering and awkwardness, the couple sat across from each other in the dining room, and Martha bowed and told them to call them when they had finished breakfast. When the servants left, the girl said that she knew about the arrival of the magicians and asked if she should sit in her chambers, and the man replied that this was not necessary and that they should avoid Stern. Bringing her fork to her mouth, the blue-eyed woman casually promised that she would not report him to the Supreme Church, since she owed her life to her husband. Rush said with a smile that it was very kind of him, and when his wife asked him to ask a small question, he immediately agreed. Syria said softly that they were talking about the Laurel estate, where conditions were anything but ordinary. The Archduke frowned slightly when she asked why the master insisted on Martha and Bastian still staying here. The fair-haired man explained that he had not given such an order. It was just that these people were connected to the estate and could not take a step beyond its borders. And the blue-eyed woman froze, mentally assuming a curse as an option. Rush continued, saying that only Marta could not leave, and the rest simply claimed that they did not want to go anywhere because they liked everything so much. Syria came to the conclusion that Martha was connected to the manor, which could no longer hold back the onslaught of demonic shadows, and therefore, when the castle collapsed, she would die. The girl asked her husband if he had turned to magicians to save the woman, and he agreed, adding that he had made similar attempts many times before. The man suddenly said that everything happened because of him, and the blue-eyed girl straightened up a little, asking in surprise how she could understand this. Later, while walking through the snow-covered garden, Syria asked Lenin if the gentleman had really gone to check the boundaries, despite the fact that the snowdrifts had already reached his height. The assistant replied that after their encounter with the monsters, it was reasonable, and the Archduke himself was very prudent. The girl asked worriedly if something would happen to him in such weather, and the young man, with slight confusion, said that nothing like that ever happened to the gentleman. When Stern asked if he couldn't get sick, Lenin explained that she didn't know her husband very well yet, but in fact, he was an unusual person who would get out of the heart of an endless desert alive. Remembering Rush's words about his guilt in what happened and the pain on his face at that moment, Syria exhaled and decided to ask her assistant about it, calling him by name. Stepping closer to the young man, the blue-eyed girl asked if he could tell her in more detail what happened here and why. Lenin exhaled and agreed, reminding both his mistress and himself that she too was now an official member of the Burke household. The young man began to say that everything happened back when the gentleman was only 15 years old. Then his father, the previous Archduke of the Empire, brought his illegitimate son to this estate, and both wanted to overthrow the lord from his place as heir. The Archduke always found something to rudely reproach his son for, considering him not so much a child as a subordinate. Moreover, he threatened little Sir Eliot, who was the master's only knight at that moment, with the chest of the Emerald Sea. This chest was an heirloom of House Burke, used by skilled glory-seeking knights who wished to become protectors of Laurel Manor, and those who placed a lock of their hair in the chest would never be able to leave the estate grounds again. The Archduke continued to press Sir Eliot, demanding to know why he refused to do this, since he truly intended to become a knight of the House of Burke. In the end, Madame Martha put a lock of her hair there so that the master's only knight would not forever belong to this place, and since then, he has not been able to leave it. Exhaling, Lenin added that there were many more details to the story, but he had explained everything to her briefly. Blue Eyes lowered her head, thinking about how none of this was in the book, and wondering why Father Rush had done this to the child and the woman. Raising his hand, the assistant asked the lady not to be offended by the fact that her husband had brought her to such a terrible place with such a history. Lenin explained that the gentleman only wanted to introduce his wife to Madame Marthe, and Syria hastened to assure him that she was not at all offended. Smiling, the girl said that, on the contrary, she was grateful for such important, even personal information that he had shared with a virtual stranger. Wiping away tears of happiness with a handkerchief, the young man objected that she was not a stranger at all, but a true member of the House of Burke, and as soon as the imperial family approved their union, Syria would become the closest person to the Archduke. He enthusiastically stated how much he looked forward to the day when he could officially name the girl Archduchess. Blue Eyes looked around the castle with longing, thinking that there must be a way to save this estate and the people who had long considered this place their home. So the next day arrived, at the beginning of which the sun pleasantly illuminated the snowy terrain, making the crisp snow shine like precious stones. Standing near the wall and holding her hand over the demonic shadow, Syria had been toiling over the complex work for several hours. It turned out that she could cleanse the room of this filth, but at such a low speed, it would definitely take a couple of thousand years. Blue Eyes remembered that in the novel, Lena discovered the source of energy and purified it using her saint power, so there must be a source here too. She was suddenly distracted by the soft call of the butler Bastion, and the girl turned around, distracted from useless actions. He introduced the lady to a red-haired woman named Suzette, who bowed and said that she worked at the estate as a seamstress and gardener. Stepping towards them, the Archduke's wife introduced herself with a smile as Syria Stern and said that she was also pleased to meet them. Syria's eyes widened in surprise when Bastion asked her to go to the dining room, where they had already prepared dishes for her that would suit her taste. When the girl was seated at a festively decorated table, strewn with various kinds of desserts and sweets, Martha said with a smile that no one else in their estate ate such things. She blushed and added that they were a little puzzled when the gentleman suddenly brought so much of this food here. Stepping closer to the Duchess, Martha asked if she understood correctly that all the desserts were intended for Syria, and she asked again in surprise if she understood her correctly. Blue Eyes said that she liked sweets, but she could hardly eat that much. But Bastion remembered the master's words that the lady really liked this kind of food, and his colleague confirmed this. Syria froze in surprise, but remembered Rush's words that only Marta could leave her estate, while the rest wished to stay here of their own free will. She turned her head and asked the butler what was the reason he had told his lordship that he wanted to continue to stay in this place. Recalling that conversation, Bastion explained that there was a peculiar boulder here that consisted of a special type of sugar. The man added that he told the Archduke that after trying this sugar, no other tastes were a joy to him, but he, of course, did not believe him. The servants became more serious, looking at their mistress with a rather uncomprehending expression and not knowing where she was leading with such questions. Syria assumed that this was Rush's way of showing the butler what sweets existed outside the estate, hinting that it was time to move forward. Marta and Bastion froze in emotion, their eyes wide open when they heard such a conclusion from the blue-eyed girl. Covering her face with her hands, the woman said that the gentleman was still the same small and kind boy they remembered him as, and the man agreed, saying that he had not even suspected the significance of these actions. Looking at the servants, Syria thought tenderly that the Archduke, although he seemed strict, treated his servants with great care. She knew that all these problems did not directly concern her, but she became sad and lowered her head, feeling an unpleasant pang in her heart. Later, as she walked down the stairs covered in dark mold, the girl was ready to admit something to herself. Blue Eyes became truly attached to this place, which she had never expected to get to and which she did not know. Once in Syria's body, she accepted the burden of suffering every day just to survive. But here she was able to rest for the first time in a long time, and fell in love with the spacious and serene estate. Thinking about the fact that this place was hardly mentioned in the novel, and Lena was not there, and Rush grew up in it, the girl decided that she could very well consider it her personal one. Pressing her palms to her chest, the blue-eyed girl thought that she could be sure that the Laurel estate would never abandon her for the saint, as Callus had done. Then she clearly decided to save this place, thinking that first she had to find the source of the demonic energy. After a couple of hours of wandering around the huge palace, Syria came to a staircase leading to a dark place, from where she felt familiar coils of magic. Staring into the darkness, the girl thought that the source of energy must be right there. Blue Eyes remembered that the mages from Nesla had just arrived and went to the basements to work and avoid being seen by Sterna. Thoughtfully putting her hand to her lips and wondering what to do now, she did not hear the approach of someone else's footsteps. Syria let out a scream and jumped in fright when Lennon suddenly put his hand on her shoulder and asked the lady what she was doing there. Turning around and sighing heavily, the girl said that he had scared her, and the assistant smiled, asking for forgiveness, but suddenly they swung at him. The Archduchess's large blue eyes widened in surprise as the man hunched over slightly, groaning. A little while later, Lennon fell to his knees and then fell backwards right in front of her from a sharp blow. Crouching down in fear and clenching her fists, the girl stuttered and asked what had happened to him, not at all expecting such a turn of events. She turned around to look at the offender and saw the already familiar maid, a dressmaker with red hair and a short haircut. Suzette stood before her, clutching the hilt of a sword in her hand, hidden in a sheath that did not at all match the attire of an ordinary worker. Addressing her formally, Syria asked the girl in surprise why she had knocked Lennon unconscious with one blow, and the dressmaker explained that he had dared to sneak up on the lady and frighten her. The redhead calmly added that there was no need to address her so formally, and the blue-eyed girl thought that such behavior frightened her. Pulling her sword out of its sheath, Suzette said that she had been trying to correct her assistant's bad habits for a long time, and asked him to forgive this one-time oversight. But the blue-eyed girl nervously assured her that everything was fine. Thinking about everything that was happening, Stern suddenly decided that this strange girl somehow reminded her of Abigail in her character. With those slightly crazy yellow eyes, she seemed much more unpredictable and cruel. Syria froze, her mouth slightly open, and her eyes wide in surprise, when the maid asked her mistress if she wanted to inspect the basement. Blue Eyes asked excitedly if she could do this, and Suzette said that there was no place on the estate where the Archduchess was not allowed. She clasped her hands together and even blushed with delight as the dressmaker explained that Rush had given his permission and they could go wherever they wanted. Later, the girls went down to the basement, heading to where the mages were trying to heal the estate, and Syria covered her face with her hand, smelling the smell of burnt herbs. Opening the heavy door and looking inside, the girl saw 3 people dressed in black cloaks and standing in a circle of bowls of fire. On the floor, in the bag, she suddenly saw dark blue and green leaves of the insania grass, which was a weed, but acted like a good sleeping pill on those with divine power. Syria thought gloomily about how the mages dared to use her now, when Rush, the owner of the estate and the head of the 17 great houses famous for their divine power, was nearby. She called out to the men, and they turned to face her, their faces hidden in the shadows of their cloaks, but their eyes glowing bright yellow and with something unkind. The blue-eyed woman folded her arms across her chest and sternly said that the Duke was currently in the estate, and therefore this herb could not be burned in his presence, because its vapors were dangerous. One of the mages stepped towards her, and calling her a lady, stated that, as far as they knew, his lordship would be absent for some time, so there was no problem. Pointing to the box that was practically gushing with demonic energy, he added that this was an important part of their attempts to dispel this sinister thing. While the girl was looking thoughtfully at the emerald sea chest, the magician came closer and demanded to know who she was. The impudent men were interrupted by a sharp and low cry from Syria, who was not going to tolerate such treatment. She folded her arms across her chest and said that they knew perfectly well who she was, asking where they had the audacity to demand answers from her. Blue-Eyed skillfully imitated the character and behavior of the real series, although inside she was shaking from the guard and felt like her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. The girl stepped forward, but her path was blocked by a magician who extended his long arm, asking if she realized where she was and what was happening. He let out a deep sigh and froze as the tip of a glittering sword hovered just next to his neck. Suzette, holding the gun to his neck, asked him if he had gone mad and declared that he was no one and had no right to block the mistress's path. Stepping towards the chest and stretching out her palms to test her strength, Syria thought with regret that her skills, like in the book, were not enough, because she was not Lena. The man began to threaten that he would not be able to finish his work if they continued to interfere with his spell, but the blue-eyed woman turned and said that they had no business here, calling Suzette to follow her. As she left the dungeon, she clenched her fists and was sure that the emerald sea chest was the cause of all the problems. Later, when the sun was already setting, the Archduchess decided to seriously discuss this issue with her husband and offer him a solution to the problem. After handing her husband the magic branch, Syria said that she wanted him to carry it with him, because every day he went out to check if there were any monsters nearby. He said there was no need since she was stern, but the blue-eyed girl said she couldn't hug him and cleanse him the way she did with Lennon. Rush asked if she shouldn't feel more comfortable hugging him since they were married, and the blue-eyed girl asked, confused, if he wanted her to hug him. She said that this could be arranged, but not in their chambers, but for example in the chalet, and asked with a smile whether they would go there. The Archduke closed his eyes and sighed, shaking his head, and then muttered condescendingly that his wife was sometimes surprisingly naive. The girl blushed and looked up at him in surprise, unable to say anything in response to such a remark. Changing the subject, she muttered that she had gone down to the basement today, and Rush asked how the work of the invited magicians was going, and the blue-eyed girl replied that they had behaved impudently, but Suzette had reined them in. The man then teased her, asking if she could manage it alone, but then pointed his finger at the knitted flowers, asking what they were. The girl muttered that the dressmaker had knitted them, Martha had brought her milk, and then suddenly thought about the fact that none of them had appeared in the story, and wondered if all the inhabitants of the estate had disappeared if they had not appeared in the original story. Blue-Eyed decided that it would be terrible to remain silent at the moment when you know the solution to such a problem, and so she exhaled and called his lordship. The Archduke froze in surprise when his wife announced that she had found a way to cleanse the estate of evil forces. He opened his bright red eyes, looking at the girl and asking how she managed to do it and what she meant by that. Looking down, Syria said that she was convinced that only Saint Lena would be able to deal with this problem. She wondered with regret and jealousy whether she would eventually be the reason for the brunette and the Archduke getting together. The blue-eyed girl squeezed the skirt of her dress because she knew that their marriage was temporary, but giving this girl first Callus and then Rush was too strange. Suddenly, the man interrupted the flow of thoughts, pointing out to his wife that enough of these assumptions and conversations. He calmly sipped his tea as if nothing serious had happened, and Syria asked what he meant. The Archduke said that there was no point in mentioning this saint anymore and asked if she could not deal with the demonic energy herself, and the girl refused, asking if he did not believe her. The man calmly stated that he had no desire whatsoever to allow a woman who was not connected to his family to come into the house, and that she was unlikely to show up at the first call. Putting her hand to her chest, Stern suggested to her husband that the saint temporarily act as her companion, adding that she would not be able to do this herself. Exhaling loudly, Rush became more stern than usual and said that he thought he should express himself more quickly. Looking straight into Syria's eyes, he said that he did not wish to bring any women to this estate except his Archduchess. The fire in the fireplace crackled loudly, while the blue-eyed girl could not understand why he was so stubborn, although she felt a pleasant excitement from such words. Remembering the unpleasant Lena and all the events associated with her, the blue-eyed girl thought with regret that she was the only one who could save this place. Lowering her head, the girl said that she knew the presumption of these words, but she did not want any of the inhabitants here to die. Covering his face with his hand, Rush muttered why his wife had even decided to suggest calling the saint. Syria's eyes widened in surprise when her husband suddenly asked her if she really had no pride at all. The man stated that the Archduchess could worry about all these people, but first and foremost, she should think only about herself and her destiny. The girl felt the whole spectrum of emotions, from shame to jealousy, when the fair-haired man asked if his wife was afraid that he would follow in the footsteps of the Marquis of Hanet. The estate was beautiful, perfect, and peaceful, and the people there were kind and willing to share their kindness. She was simply sure that if Lena ended up here, she could become the center of this small world, and just thinking about it made Syria envious. Suddenly, his imagination drew a picture of what would happen if Rush also chose the brunette. Blue-eyed felt her heart beating somewhere in her throat from fear and resentment at the possibility of such an outcome of events. The girl thought angrily that she simply wanted to help the local inhabitants and this place, and therefore did not deserve such harsh words, and stood up, saying that the Archduke was not like Callus. Syria stated irritably that the Marquis of Hanet had been her choice, but she had not chosen the Laurel estate or her husband. Taking this personally, Rush even predatorily stated that the girl was right in her thoughts that he was not the man she had chosen. The blue-eyed girl said that since they had already discussed it, she asked him to refrain from paying too much attention to her person, but the fair-haired man assumed that she had misunderstood the words regarding his Archduchess. Turning around, Syria said it was very impudent of her to be misled. Taking hold of the door handle, the girl turned around and declared that she didn't care whether he called Lena or not, and therefore he should think about it carefully. The Archduke froze, watching her go, and exhaled loudly when the door slammed shut. He placed his hands on his knees and gripped his hair, pulling it from the roots and trying to catch his breath after the unexpected argument. Walking around the estate in the evening, the girl thought that everything had turned out very unpleasant, although they had managed to get along recently. Blue Eyes looked out the window, thinking about Lennon's words about Martha being connected to this place because of Rush's illegitimate half-brother, born from another woman. Remembering the Archduke's words, Syria mentally agreed with why he didn't want to see Lena at the Laurel estate, and yet she was very angry and upset by the fact that her husband asked her such a question, remembering the Marquis of Hanet. Suddenly, she was distracted from her thoughts, noticing a man in front of her, lying unconscious on the floor. Taking a hesitant step closer, the blue-eyed girl swallowed loudly, realizing that she could see the unfortunate Martha in the distance. The Archduchess rushed towards the woman and fell on her knees before her, gently shaking the servant by the shoulders and asking her to wake up and come to her senses. Feeling something hot and wet, Syria raised her hand and was frightened to see blood on her palm, which had appeared on Martha's back. Wanting to call her husband and help as soon as possible, the blue-eyed girl turned around, wanting to get up from her knees. The girl opened her mouth and froze, seeing a sharp blade in front of her, pointing at her neck. The magician standing in front of Syria smiled and covered her mouth with his hand, then said that he had found the best candidate for an offering to his god. He declared that the girl should follow him, but suddenly flew forward and screamed hoarsely when Suzette, who had arrived in time, kicked him in the back. The redhead leaned over to the lady sitting on the floor and asked worriedly if her ladyship was okay. Rush, who had heard the noise and noticed Madame Marta lying motionless on the floor, was already hurrying towards them. At the same time, the attacker was lying on the floor after a strong blow and wheezing, trying to get his breathing back in order. Standing up, Syria screamed in anger, asking the magician who he was and for what purpose he had come to this estate. Mentally thanking her intuition, the Archduchess remembered how she had asked Suzette if she was a knight. When the red-haired woman agreed, the lady said that something about these people seemed suspicious to her, and therefore asked her not to take her eyes off them. Frowning, the girl thought that she could have assumed some kind of nastiness or disrespectful attitude, but not this kind of behavior. Turning to the maid, she asked what happened to the other shamans, and the red-haired one replied that she had left one tied up on the first floor and then came here for the other two. Suddenly, Suzette heard a noise and a growl, immediately turning back to where the maid should have been lying defeated. Having risen, the unknown man grabbed the blade and rushed towards Syria, and the maid hurried to try to push her mistress away, but she would hardly have had time. Suddenly, a dagger flew past at speed, millimeters from the blue-eyed girl's neck, cutting off a small lock of hair. It hit the maddened mage right in the chest, causing him to scream loudly and let go of his weapon, stopping. Rush, who had just saved his wife, angrily walked forward and shouted at the shaman, calling him and his people common savages. Later, lying in her bed, the girl hugged the blanket to her chest and thought with excitement about how difficult and even scary the day had been. Turning onto her side, Syria remembered how the Archduke had asked her to return to her quarters and how uncomfortable she had been after their unexpected quarrel. She couldn't sleep, thinking about the fact that they had managed to save Martha, who was lucky that the attacker hadn't hit her vital organs. The girl was suddenly distracted from her thoughts and heard the slow steps of Rush, who sat down on the bed and quietly called her name. Pretending to be asleep, she mentally declared that she would not speak to the man. He might not even hope to, and in general he should go to sleep in a chair or settle down on the floor. Suddenly, her husband touched her cheek with the back of his hand, and Syria's eyes widened, unable to pretend so carefully and not pay attention to such touches. Gently pushing aside a strand of her cool green hair, Rush touched the girl's neck and chin with cool fingers. A strong hand slid softly down her shoulder and back, heading towards her waist and pushing the warm blanket down. The girl jumped up, sitting up on the bed and blushing brightly, asking the Archduke what he was doing, and he moved away a little, smiling at her embarrassment. The man immediately explained, looking at her with a gentle gaze of red eyes, and explained that he simply wanted to check for sure whether she was injured. Rush said that she had told Suzette that she was suspicious of the shamans, and could have been seriously hurt if that blade had hit its target, and then asked if she realized how she was putting herself at risk. Raising her head and clutching the blanket with her fingers, the blue-eyed girl objected that they would not dare to harm her, because they knew that she was Sterna. When the girl said that nothing that could worry Rush would happen, he called her by name and said that she knew perfectly well what exactly he was worried about. Looking at her, the Archduke asked why she had not shared with him her impressions about the visiting magicians. Still holding a grudge, Syria asked what she could say to someone who had decided to end her marriage, only to later ridicule the choice she had made. She said openly that the Archduke took every opportunity to hurt her, and she had upset him, so he tried to intimidate her into silence. Looking down with a disappointed expression and barely managing to control her breaking voice, the blue-eyed girl asked if after all this he really expected her to discuss her safety with him. The man looked at his wife in surprise, his mouth slightly open, while the girl continued her tirade and asked what he would do in her place. Rush said that he never wanted to do that to her and extended his hand forward, but the blue-eyed girl turned away, not allowing him to touch her. For a moment, silence reigned in the chambers. Only two excited hearts beat in unison with each other. The blonde man suddenly apologized and looked down, saying that he really shouldn't have thrown around comments so thoughtlessly. Syria stared at her husband in surprise, because he not only apologized, but did it twice. The girl wanted to talk to him, but first she decided to get out from under the blanket, but slipped and hit Rush's thigh with her foot, letting out an embarrassed yelp. He muttered that it didn't even tickle him, let alone hurt, and added that Stern didn't know how to attack a knight, but the girl said it was just an accident. Syria blushed and thought that even if he apologized, she shouldn't have held on to her pride, And besides, she understood why he was saying all this. Having called his lordship, the blue-eyed girl sat up on the bed and moved to the edge, as if showing that she was letting him into their common territory. The Archduke asked if the girl wanted him to lie down next to her, and she blushed, closed her eyes, and muttered whether it was necessary to ask such an awkward question. Coughing into her fist, Syria said that he was probably very tired, and therefore would hardly want to spend the night sitting, and Rush replied with a smile that he would not be surprised by such a proposal from the lady. Moving her hand away from her face, the girl asked who he thought she was, and asked if he would wish something like that on her. Moving closer and placing his hand on her cheek, Rush said with a smile that he would never wish for it. The man climbed onto the bed, without removing his palm from his beloved wife's face, leaning towards her face and asking her to call him by name. Syria blushed brightly, having no idea how to behave in such a situation, and asked his lordship to wait, but he was clearly not in the mood for that. The Archduke moved right up to her lips, so close that they could feel each other's hot breath, and he himself said his name, as if reminding her of the request. Clutching her own dress in her hands and feeling herself melting in his arms like ice cream, the girl obediently whispered his name, not wanting to fight her feelings. They touched in a soft and slow kiss, when suddenly a sound of unknown origin was heard in the room. Pulling back and thus breaking their first such touch, Syria asked in fear what that sound was. Rush lowered his hand from his wife's face, asking what sound he was talking about, and she asked in fear if he really couldn't hear it. Smiling slightly and closing his eyes, the man shook his head and said that, of course, he heard everything. He just wanted a joke. Looking reproachfully at her husband, the blue-eyed woman asked what kind of jokes these were, and added that she had almost gone crazy. He got out of bed and said that he too was ready to lose his mind, because no one but him in the entire estate could hear it. Left sitting on the bed alone, the girl thought about how loud it was and couldn't understand if it was really just the two of them who heard it. She thought about how the Girox Empire was founded by a great saint, Gremmel, who was blessed by the heavens themselves, given 2 divine gifts, great fortune, and 17 houses with their own personal divine power. Thanks to Gremmel, these houses continued to pass on holy magic to new generations, and are now known by the holy title of Grand Von Schett, with the representative houses of Hanet, Kelladine, and Burke. Calling out to the man who was already leaving, Syria asked if he knew if there was an altar in the basement, but Rush replied that there could be nothing like that in these parts. The girl said that she definitely felt some kind of weak power when she was there earlier, and assumed that it came from the old relic, and the source of the shadows was also there. The Archduke listened to her thoughts, while the blue-eyed girl muttered out loud everything that came to her mind after certain memories. Placing his hands on her fragile shoulders, the fair-haired man asked his wife to stay here, in safety, saying that he himself would see what was there. Later, when he had just left the chambers, holding a lantern in his hand, Syria caught up with him and hugged him by the hand, saying that he had apparently forgotten about the essence of his wife. When all the lights behind them went out, the girl clutched Rush's strong hand tighter, not understanding when this whole story turned into a horror story. The Archduke noticed how much she was shaking and asked if the blue-eyed girl was cold, but she muttered that she was simply afraid. Gently catching her hand, the man intertwined their fingers, pulling Syria closer to his body. He said with a smile that the big paradox was that before she often behaved very thoughtlessly, and now she was shaking simply because of the darkness. Smiling at her behavior, Rush tightly wrapped his fingers around her small palm, wanting to make his wife feel protected. They walked down the corridor together, holding hands, and the girl couldn't help but notice how big and warm the man's hands were. As they descended to where they planned, the blond man raised his lantern, illuminating a professional portrait of a stranger with soft features. The man explained with a smile that the image showed them both the former Archduchess of the House of Burke. He added that this was his mother, and Syria looked at the portrait in surprise, thinking about how beautiful this woman was. While she was looking at the portrait, the fair-haired man leaned over and began to leaf through some book, some of the pages of which had been torn out. Rush explained that these were historical records of the Burke house, from which some information was missing, and so they were taken downstairs for safety. Blue-eyed remembered that this book was mentioned a couple of times in the novel, but neither the man himself nor anyone else attached any special significance to it. Syria silently suggested that the Archduke's father might have destroyed the records himself when he learned of the existence of his illegitimate son. Wondering if the man was trying to sabotage the rule of his own son, Rush, she realized that he only knew part of his family history. Clenching her hands into fists, the blue-eyed girl mentally called the man who was capable of doing this to his own son a scoundrel. Syria suddenly felt a familiar energy, and while the blonde man continued reading the book, she turned and walked forward. Where the energy came from, the Archduchess was surprised to see a monolith made of constellation steel, wondering why they would put it in the estate. Then her attention was drawn to an interesting decoration, a gold tiara with elegant patterns and designs, and also with large red stones. She felt an insanely obvious desire to take this amazing product, and she herself was surprised by it, but she could hardly resist. Syria stepped even closer to the pedestal, and the energy pulling her towards the object only grew stronger, so she extended her hand forward. Noticing the strange light and the absence of his wife nearby, Rush turned around and called the blue-eyed woman by name, and then asked what she was doing there. He ran forward when he saw a sudden surge of divine energy caused by the girl's touch on the family heirloom. She opened her eyes in surprise, feeling herself overwhelmed with a previously unknown strength and warmth. Memories of Rouge and her whole life rushed through her mind, and she suddenly saw a dark figure who was tearfully begging the moon not to reject her. Inhaling fearfully and feeling the heat throughout her body from the horror that had gripped her, the girl opened her eyes and realized that she was lying in her bed. Looking at the bright room in front of her, Syria blinked slowly, trying to remember where she was, since her last memory was of Laurel's estate. Blue-eyed suddenly heard a familiar voice calling her mistress, and a second later she found herself in Abigail's warm embrace. The knight whispered that on the third day of the girl's unconsciousness, she was close to destroying that damn estate with her bare hands. Syria was surprised to learn about these 3 days, and assumed that if Ibi was nearby, it meant that she had been returned to the main Burke estate. The dark-haired woman confirmed this, and explained that they were in the Archduchess's chambers, adding that his lordship had ordered the servants to bring her here. The girl suddenly froze and smiled brightly, seeing Bastian and Suzette smiling near the entrance to her new chambers. When she asked what they were doing here in the main estate, both servants knelt down, and the man asked them to accept the deepest gratitude from them and Madame Martha. He looked up, his eyes filled with kindness and tears, and said that they would never forget the price they had paid to save Laurel Manor. Bastian explained to the bewildered lady that the shadows had completely disappeared, and Suzette declared that they wanted to devote themselves entirely to serving the lady. Syria froze in surprise upon hearing such news, and did not understand what was happening, since Lena had not come close to that place. Martha, meanwhile, calmly wrapped herself in a shawl and walked through the snow-covered garden of the newly revived and beloved estate. She said with joy and trepidation how nice it was to see that this beautiful place had returned to its former glory. She clasped her hands and thought with pleasure that the House of Burke had finally found itself an excellent archduchess. Looking at the pillow with the tiara in front of her, Syria asked if she had lost consciousness for such a long time when she touched the thing. Immediately remembering the decoration, the blue-eyed girl realized that the diadem had ended up in the hands of Syria's older brother, Nisus Keladon, who had given it to Lena after a fierce fight between several minor male characters. After this, the saint, of course, immediately began to wear the received decoration every time she went out. Lost in thought, the girl couldn't understand how the tiara ended up in Laurel's estate, because she thought that Nisus simply bought it at some auction, and Suzette asked what was bothering her. The lady smiled nervously, immediately asking whether the decoration should be given to Rush if it was found in the estate. She froze in surprise and opened her blue eyes wide when she learned that her husband had given this tiara to her. The girl asked why he was giving her such a valuable thing, since it was an important family heirloom, and the red-haired girl smiled and noted that everything that the Burke house owned now belonged to her too. Grabbing her head, Syria thought about what was going on here and involuntarily formed a vision in her head, wondering if the Archduke could be asking not to reject him. Blue Eyes folded her arms across her chest and thought about how she didn't remember any such visions in the original story. Wondering if she might have forgotten parts of the plot, the girl gradually began to return to the busy palace life. As she walked through the garden in the evening, Rush covered her shoulders with his fur cloak, smiling and asking if she really wanted to freeze to death. The couple sat down on a bench, and the man said that he understood the girl's desire to see him, but she could tell Lennon about it, and she shook her head, explaining that it was not an urgent matter. Looking at the blue-eyed girl, the man gently asked if she was feeling better, worrying about her well-being. Turning pink and adjusting his cloak, Syria said with a smile that he had asked about this much faster than usual. Immediately saying that this was what she wanted to talk about, the girl lifted the tiara from her chest, which she decided to wear as a necklace, and thanked him for such a gift. Explaining her decision, the blue-eyed woman said that putting such a thing on her head would be a little strange for her, presenting herself in a less than favorable light. Rush muttered with a smile that it didn't sound so terrible at all, and the Archduchess asked if he was serious about it. The man, teasing his wife, said that it was not for him to wear it, and when Saria asked if he wanted to, he leaned forward, saying that only if she put the jewelry on him herself. The fair-haired man smiled warmly at the blue-eyed girl's coquetry when she cheerfully asked if he really hoped that she wouldn't dare to do something like that. Pulling off the pendant with the tiara, the girl asked Rush to tilt his head slightly towards her. The man said he would do whatever she wanted, and bowed his head to be on the same level as hers. Blushing, Saria thought that her husband was very close, so close that she could catch his warm breath. The girl caught the blonde man's gaze, which was gentle, but not devoid of the already familiar desire to touch her or make her even more